The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
All right, so let's get started. Okay, good afternoon. Finally spring here, yeah, so which means you want to be out, not inside a room. First, we're going to go over the strategy aspect. This will give us a chance to reflect of the whole content we went through the whole term, by maybe using the idea of setting up a strategy to try to connect the different sessions that we kind of covered throughout. And also we're going to spend some time on the team project final deliverable. I know there's some questions. You're meeting with us if you haven't already met already, and I want to answer those. So you are prepared to work on the final report. And then on Wednesday, we're going to hear firsthand from EMC on how they think about sustainability strategy. The sustainability group, so the director, one of the head people there is going to come here, and you're going to have a chance to validate and maybe get some of your questions answered on how a company actually makes this happen in a little bit larger scale.
I just want to go online too. EMC has one of the better sustainability reporting. Go on their website and kind of look around what kind of information they're disclosing, so you can kind of look at that relative to what your companies are, because I would say they're sort of ahead of the game. And also maybe some questions to think about for Katie Schindel, who will be coming on Wednesday.
Yeah, great. So that's a little bit of the administrative aspect. So this paper, who had read it before? Before class, before we assigned it. So in the past, in which context did you read it?
It was for like a McKinsey thing I was on a while back.
Okay. How about you? Where did you read it before?
Oh, sorry. I thought it's on this class.
Oh, okay. No, this actually is a very good paper. I'm not sure if you. This is actually the one I always go back to over time, because it has some fundamental insights that I think is worth revisiting. This is. Even though it's not written for supply chain necessarily, it's not written for environmental supply chain either. It's really more on general CSR. But I think some of the key aspects of this paper are, I think, critical when you have to make this happen in practice. This is very much connected to what we see, and Alexis and I have been talking to people on, especially the pitfalls on how people address environmental aspects in their company and beyond. So why don't we start by who would like to kind of give me a summary of the premise, the basic premise that Porter puts forward in this article. So let's start there.
Well, he's kind of saying that just the CSR is not enough, and that people are kind of taking the CSR as like kind of the end all and trying to put in these indexes without really knowing a lot of the true information. So by doing that, they're actually kind of going away from their true goal, which is improvement in these areas. So he's kind of looking at what are different ways that aside from this generally accepted CSR standard that we can use to get companies to focus more on the social aspect, social responsibility.
Okay, that's one. Would you like to add something?
He kind of advocates for moving from corporate social responsibility towards corporate social integration, and also that sometimes companies spread their resources too thin, meeting all these kind of NGO demands or kind of external pressures that aren't necessarily that integral to their supply chain, and they could perhaps have more of an impact if they focused on one area in particular.
Let me see if I can get those three ideas here. One is the, focus too much on the stakeholders. We'll talk a little bit more about that one. They integrate to the business, I guess a little bit of what you were saying as well. Some of the index traps is one of the stakeholders. And this is not a trivial problem. And let me just relay back. I'm not sure I can tell the full company name yet, but soon we will. So we were talking to one of the major companies, and we were asking them, how do you start your green sustainability strategy? They said, we did this. We went to all the indexes that were out there that were ranking companies. We looked exactly and why they were not ranking as well. And then we started addressing, that gave us like a guiding post where we wanted to achieve, wanted to be number one in all those indexes. And then we look at what the feedback they were providing us, and we work on it. And we're doing very well. They're ranked much better, of course, than before. But this is specifically, in this Porter article, specifically advises against that. So it advises against that in multiple dimensions. One dimension is, these indexes are convoluted, right? But there's like a fundamental, I guess, problem is that this doesn't go beyond what your company does. It's what somebody else cares about, not what your company cares about. And the indexes, although are the most visible part, that's not really, it's not going to be there to stay, I think. Yeah? That's really the thing. It's not that it's bad to use them, it's just that if you think that's the ultimate goal, you will never be able to go the momentum beyond the CSR head. Whomever is starting this project, great. They're going to be able to move this ahead. But once this person leaves or the company changes, this is going to be gone. And this could be 5 years, this could be 7 years. That's unknown, but that's, I think, one of the problems. So I want to at least tell that story. Focus too much on the stakeholder. And so you had a third idea, but I forgot what you forgot too?
I forgot too, yeah.
Okay, good. That's good. Anything else that you think were the key messages from this article that are not those three?
I thought it was important to the way you broke up 4 different types of CSR. So there was the license to operate, the moral obligation, sustainability, and reputation.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good too. And the reason I think it's pretty good is because most of us, the first time we think through this, these are the 4 things that come to mind of why a company do it. So one is the moral argument. The other one was the license to operate argument. The other one that is maybe the one that we, even within MIT, we talk a lot more is the sustainability argument. And the third one is the reputation. Who remembers why those 4 he claims are incomplete? It's not that they're wrong, it's that they were incomplete to capture the true motivation and meaning to drive and move change in organization towards CSR or sustainability. So let's talk about the moral argument. What was the main problem of using a moral view of the world to say this is what we should do? This is the good thing for us to do. This is why our business should do it.
It wasn't very easily measurable.
The number one is measurement, which is always going to be a challenge, right? So measurement. So what was the problem with the moral? What was the problem with the measurement aspect? Not easy measurable, that's one thing, but what does he mean by that?
I think there's some things that are kind of like in these like overlaps, a gray areas, that when you do one thing, but you kind of like, you kind of destroy value in another area, and how do you actually get that to mesh?
Yeah, so the measurement is that we all, as individuals, we probably have our own moral values, and when we decide, should I take that extra piece of Coke, I paid for 1 drink, I want to top it off, you put like a little bit more than you paid for, and you're doing like a moral analysis, right? And you do it internally, and it's easy, right? You say, well, last time I had less, so maybe on average I'm consuming the right amount of soda, and I'm okay of going back to the line and getting soda even though I pay for 1 drink. It's like a moral choice. And you do it at the individual level, it's easy maybe to do those trade-offs because they're not quantifiable. But if you go like a big company, like they use this example of Google, you have 2 different moral choices, right? It's one, openness, you want freedom, but on the other hand, you also want to give access to people to technology. So how do you balance those 2? And where you cannot measure things, it all becomes a choice that is, of leadership or some sort, and you cannot translate that into business over time. That's one. The other thing is the moral compass changes from one place to the other, from one context to the other. How can a company be run that way? It's not that morality is not part of the business decisions, but rather making that the main driving force for CSR does not allow you to do trade-offs properly. That's kind of what his main argument was, the measurement aspect. Lack of measurement is reality on moral decisions, but you cannot make the trade-offs. And businesses are all about trade-offs. That was kind of one of his main, let's say, counter-arguments. So that's morality. License to operate.
You said that they don't take, so since you're trying to look good in the eyes of the community you operate in, you answer to their requests, but you're not taking into account how you operate and what your competitive advantages are.
Yeah, so it's a dichotomy between your capabilities and what this community wants, right? So this does not take into account. Also, this goes back, he talks there about different contexts as well, right? The context changes. Reputation. This is the interesting one, because actually Alex and I spent a lot of time on trying to look for this information. What was the main argument against the reputation kind of bad approach for justifying CSR? Someone remembers?
A lot of times it could just be
Very quickly.
just a marketing campaign.
Marketing?
Instead of like a true, measure of what they're doing. So they're just
something more fundamental. It's true, it's a bit of marketing, but it's not proven. See, we have not been able to find a real evidence that this actually works. That this branding creates business value, which is very surprising. But it's surprising because in the companies that are willing to do it very well, it's hard to differentiate how much is brand, how much is business. How do you make that argument? And I think we tried several times, Alexis, to find some good studies that show that being greener gives you better return over investment or business value. But actually, most of the studies are the reverse, right? They say, well, companies are doing great, they tend to be greener, right? Or more sustainable. But you can never find the other argument. So doesn't mean that there's no value in it. It's hard to distinguish that value from the normal operation of the business. So even if you try to go that path, you will not ever get a good sense of how good value it will give you, which goes back to why would you even choose to do it? When the times get tough and you have to cut budgets, how can you justify doing this? I mean, he always thinks on how businesses should do this later. So a little bit of the value of marketing is unclear value of brand.
Yeah, we even wanted to look the opposite way. That if you got attacked, like in the case of Nestle and Tic Tac situation when there was the Greenpeace attacks, and we wanted to see the stock dip, and it maybe went down a few cents for one day, and then it went it evened out. So unfortunately, even the reverse is not true.
The only example we found, which actually is the scary example, the only one was Nike probably, yeah? Sure. Back in the labor market. That's the only example that has been documented that is closer correlated between the attacks that they had on labor and the actual stock value. But there were other factors going on at that time. But that was enough to scare people across the world, which is good. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but he argues that's not enough. And then we go to sustainability. What's the argument he uses for sustainability not being a good driving force?
Because it's very vague. There's not a lot of basis for it, and it can also lead to misunderstanding the long-term costs for short-term gains.
Yeah. So it's vague. So the definition is great, but what is the long term? I mean, how long is the long term? How am I trading off the long term? Is this 10 years? Is this 100 years? Is this 50 years? But I have to make decisions now. I'm evaluated now. And if I always have to make these trade-offs of long term and short term, the natural path is going to be postpone the long term. And you could just postpone it. And it's hard to make it on a regular basis a decision of the short term because it's so vague. Not that it's the wrong framework, but it's just too undefined. I think those more or less were the four arguments, roughly speaking, that were outlining the wrong reasons to do sustainability. But however, if you talk to people, these are easier to explain. Look at any CEO speech. If they all of them, if someone is on the operations, they talk a lot about this license to operate, like risk, aspects, a little bit of risk management. It's very easy to understand. If I don't do the right thing, they're going to kick me out of China or out of Brazil. That's a very, very natural way to do it. This is also touches people, and that's a good way to get a rallying cry for change. This, of course, is just the overall, I guess, is the overall trend that you see in general by NGOs and media and actually ourselves here in academia. And reputation is another risk argument, and it's very well understood. You can bring it into your company, but all of those four, he basically says those should not be the right ones. Okay, so that's kind of the summary of the bad things that were happening. So he proposes a specific framework to try to think about this. So who would like to kind of give the idea of the framework he proposes? Someone remembers? That's this table. I think the table is on page 8. It says how to prioritize social issues. And he talks about two types of CSR. Well, actually, it's actually the other one. It's page 9, probably. Yeah, it's a little bit better. Page 9, he talks about these generic social impacts, value chain social impacts, and social dimensions of competitive context. You can always say Porter is really good with these words. Yeah? Social dimensions of competitive context. Pretty good. So, but those three ones basically are the way he proposes you should think about this. So let me see, who ventures to try to make sense of these three dimensions? Someone? Guesses? Zaragoza? We have someone in Zaragoza? 2 people? No one is venturing? Yeah, someone ventured. Go ahead. Save the day.
He doesn't have an answer.
No, the answer is no. No answer? Okay, so they did not save the day. So what he basically is, yeah, go ahead.
Complex, but the response to CSR is really a response to the incentives that are, because you say that the competitive aspect of the society should be more integrated. So I look at the responsive aspect as the response to incentives to be more responsible and to be a good citizen and to comply in a way, to be responsible. And then the social dimension is something that is that goes beyond just the response to the incentive of the society and just takes the need to bring even further and in a more strategic way the corporate social responsibility planning for the future. And I would take an example, like for example, the net positive of Kingfisher would be an example of this for me. Is that it means that they have a strategy of not only, for example, being at zero carbon footprint or deforestation, but they want to go beyond this and plant more trees that they virtually consume in their business for homes, and so have a net positive impact in the end. So for me, it resonated like this.
Okay, so then we have, on one end, we have the good citizenship, I guess. But what does he really mean here? Could you say that again? Maybe I missed. What is the decision for a company in the good citizenship world of view?
Complying with society's incentive regulation.
It's a little bit of saying do nothing, but do nothing irresponsibly. So basically, do nothing. Just take a look at stuff. Just do the basics. Just stay there. Stay there. Definitely, have a code of conduct on how to do labor practices, but you don't have to make this something very important in your company. You just have to make sure people understand what expectations are, have the minimal compliance in some sense, and just do the right thing. It's like what we do every day. Comply with the laws. Maybe you're not looking actively to see how these laws are changing. You just do them. That's a little bit on the left side. Why is this hard for companies to do?
Sorry.
Yes.
Also, being like a good citizen means like try to avoid like the adverse effects from the business.
So it's just avoidance of effects on the business. Yeah. So it's just make sure you don't end up in jail, which this doesn't do for a good marketing campaign. Yeah? So we're going to avoid to be in jail on labor issues. We're going to avoid to be in jail on carbon footprint. I mean, that's why companies don't talk about this that way, because you have to. It's not that sexy. So that's on one spectrum. So this is a little bit of say no. Say no, thanks. Right? So now say no. I'm not going to try to solve this problem. Yeah? I am aware of it. I recognize it. And I'm going to try to do, what the best I can, but I'm really not going to spend resources or time trying to do this.
I think it's a little bit hard to say that it's just avoiding and that it's just not doing anything and not solving the problem, because if I understood well what George says, it's also about mitigating the adverse consequences of not being good citizenship on the business. No?
Yeah, so he talks about in a little bit of the next stage. So he says there's generic social impacts, and then he has this value chain social impact. So there'll be some of those that will be closer to your business. So there's a few of them that may be not as distant as others, but the ones that are a bit closer, then definitely I want to mitigate. So in a little bit, then they move to say no thanks to mitigate risk. But you're right. In some sense, you want to list them down and have some sort of conscious decision. And I think this is anyone that has studied strategy knows that strategy is not what you decide to do. It's what most of the time you make sure you are not going to do. I'm not going to try to do. It's hard sometimes to say, I'm going to do this or that. But when you have a good strategy in your head, this issue, I know it's important, but I'm not going to try to tackle it. That's a little bit of what the same framework is trying to put forward here, is that even though it's hard to say no to one of these issues, you have to say no, because you cannot solve them all. That's the one end. And then on the other end, we have the more we call strategic CSR. This is what he calls responsiveness, I guess, responsive CSR. That is on the framework of try to say no, to try to mitigate risk. And on the other hand, you have the strategic CSR aspects of it. That those are the ones that you have to say yes to. And you say yes to in two different ways. One is I think what you were saying earlier, is the one that tries to create new competitiveness dimensions as a company. I think they use Whole Foods as one example. This is my competitiveness. My competitiveness is organic food, and I'm engaged with consumers, I'm engaged with the community, and I do everything just to position myself as a completely different retailer where people can find certain goods, where people can actually not only get their products, but help their community, and they attract a certain kind of market. And everything sustainability around Whole Foods is really tied to their not only their values, but it's how they see themselves competing. Most people, Whole Foods prides themselves that whenever there's a Whole Foods in a neighborhood, their real estate values increase. Right? Because this is like a source of change. And they compete that way, and every green environmental dimension is tied to that competitiveness. But they also, very much so, charge more. Now, most people cannot afford Whole Foods. So, and it's not the only value proposition that a retailer can have. There's other that are different. Scale, and there's other things we will talk about later. But that's the example of a strategic CSR. And there's another, he actually talks about another example there. And we saw this, we were talking with Siemens. And I think you can help me here with some of the Siemens vision. So Siemens, they do all kinds of electrical equipment for big power plants. So for them, green energy is their business of the future. So they decided we're going to sell all kinds of hydro, wind energy, and they put lots of effort into trying to sell this to other companies. But the only way you can sell this outside is if you use it inside. If you don't have good energy practices in your company, you cannot sell the product outside. So for them, it became quickly a transformation of the culture and trying to do a much better job with their own suppliers and energy management, because that's the only way you can justify that future positioning of selling wind energy and selling the future energy solutions for the world. You have to sell new products, and then you have to work on your supply chain to be as energy efficient as the products you want to sell. So they kind of transformed their CSR and their supply chain environmental practices, focusing on energy reduction and energy savings, because this was fully aligned to how they wanted to compete. GE is also mentioned here, the Eco-Imagination projects. You hear about GE. Same thing. They see this the future. People are buying these products. So my company also needs to be very good at measuring energy use and saving energy throughout my manufacturing plants and my suppliers and my suppliers. I need to be consistent because this helps my positioning of my brand. And also, these suppliers are going to be my customers. If I sell energy solutions, if my supplier needs to improve their energy, they'll buy my products. So it's a little bit of a virtuous circle, I guess. Toyota is the same thing. Toyota, they mentioned it here in the case, in the article. Now, there is the other group they call here is called Transform Value Chain Activities to Benefit Society while Reinforcing a Strategy. That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
I think, he gives the example of Nestle, and he's just talking about fully integrating whatever your CSR priorities are into how you do business every day. And that's what Nestle does. They work with small farmers, and so their impact is fully integrated into their company strategy.
Yeah. So it's just do what you do it well, and do it well sustainably. So Nestle is a good example. UPS, who's working with UPS and FedEx in their... So UPS is another great example. So UPS, they also have what the business of packaging and logistics is a very thin margin business. Every single decision you make that saves, especially at the scale of FedEx or UPS or any of these packaging companies, any gallon of fuel you save in one route, multiplied by the number of routes you run by every day, multiplied by the number of routes per year, it's millions and millions of dollars of savings. And if you do it well, your business runs better. And what they have embraced sustainability is to connect it to that particular thing. We are going to save fuel to the nth degree in every single operation we do. And this connects with what they do very well, that is logistics and transportation. So that's kind of another example of look at what you do, and what you do that matters to you, you're going to do it as sustainably or whatever the dimension as possible. You're going to leverage what you're good at to try to expand and make it sustainable in some way or another, and transform that function into a competitive advantage. That's kind of the idea he has. There's a problem with all of these, though. We'll talk about the problems later. But that's the strategic CSR. A strategic because you see a new market coming, or a strategic because you have a core competency in the way you run your business, and because of that, you should spend time there and do it better. That's kind of, I think that's the basics, the way I like to see his article. And if you ever go to a company, or this is a good one to keep around. You're going to go back to and read it multiple times over your lifetime. So before you lose your access to the MIT libraries, have a printed copy. Or you have to pay, how much is $6.99? Well, you have the budgets in the future. So now, but let's look a little bit more about about anything else that I have not covered on the basic messages of this article that someone would like to highlight that maybe he mentions at the end. No? Right.
I just wanted to make a comment.
Yeah.
Because I'm taking a marketing class, a branding class right now, and the main takeaway I got from here is, that's synonymous with what we're learning in our branding class, is DNA. Like, what we see in all the different case studies we've read is that when a company doesn't incorporate the branding message and the attributes of the key attributes of the company into their DNA, then they fall short and they're less competitive against other people who do it well. And so that's kind of what I see he's actually saying, is that if you're going to position yourself and integrate yourself as this environmental conscious company, make sure you're intertwining within the DNA of your company. Don't just do it to, address some hot issue that's in the news at this point in time, or that it sounds favorable because it's the flavor of the month. Make sure that you integrate it in everything that you do, and then that will have a huge benefit to your company, short term and long term.
Yeah. So this notion of the DNA, which when you hear people explaining it, is kind of sounds funny, but it's really the crux. Now, what does it mean to make it happen? So this is very strategic level. We're going to talk a little bit about. Okay, great. Now I'll put it into my DNA. How do I put it in my DNA? But let's look at a few things that are not here explicitly mentioned, at least, that I believe are important. So even though he doesn't talk about this in this paper specifically, he really doesn't talk much about the life cycle view of products and services. Not that, because this is a social CSR in general. So I think that's been much more developed since this was published. But this idea that you really need to think of the life cycle of a product or a service to try to inform this process. I guess it's a specific tool, or at least a view of the world that helps inform this process. Because how do you inform which areas you can prioritize or not is not very well determined here. That's one thing. And as a consequence of that, if you remember from life cycle and all the things we've heard, is that most of the emissions of any single company, actually, it doesn't matter which company you look at, are not within your company, right? They're always in your suppliers or your customers, which creates a little bit more importance to make those external connections as part of your strategy. I think he does mention it here in some places, but I think it was not as clear because of the scope of this particular paper. It was too CSR generic. We talk about environmental, even social aspects. Most of the impacts are outside your company, just because of the way the companies are structured. When you have a life cycle view, so you have to put more emphasis in those external connections, more than maybe he tries to portray in this particular article, which is why we talk about supply chain, let's say, as an enabler of this strategy. But the priorities at the high level need to be connected to the same principles. But this lack of emphasis on the life cycle view and your supply chain, I think, is the one thing that I believe is a little bit lacking. But let's look at page 5 and take a look at that diagram of page 5. I think that diagram of page 5 looks awfully familiar, or at least should look awfully familiar, except that ours is prettier. No, actually, his is prettier. So you have all the functions of the firm, the same thing we had on our day one of the class. And he has like this inbound logistics on the left side as the function that brings things in. And he has, some ideas that you have to do, the looking inside out aspect of it. Transportation, emissions, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have operations, you have emissions and waste. These are kind of the things you think you should look for inside your company for inspiration of where to take action. You have outbound logistics. It has packaging use and disposal. Then you have marketing and sales. This is more advertising and information. It's more about communication. And you have the after-sales services. And you have here disposal of obsolete products, handling of consumables, as some of the dimensions to look at. Then you have the procurement function that, in the view of a company and the strategy, specifically the way the Porter likes to think about value chains, he sees procurement as kind of a supporting function for all these functions. And he lists on the right side, he talks about uses of particular inputs. I have this bullet of utilization of natural resources. So all these kind of bullets here in this diagram are the area you should look for things to include in your strategy, I guess, and prioritize one way or the other. So you could choose and work more on reducing of packaging, if that's what you could do. All these are levers that you can somehow engage that are aligned with what you do as a company. And if you go through this list, you will see very quickly that there's some things that you see all over the place happening that make sense to companies. So let's start with one, waste. Why is waste always going to work in every single company? Waste is money that you are throwing to the garbage, right? So whatever you can do to extract value of that waste, always going to work. So this is kind of a natural connection with any environmental initiative you find in the planet. Doesn't matter which one it is. Even if your company does like zero interest in the environment, waste always connects with the environment, always. So that's always a natural, you see that highlighted in your reports of your companies, zero waste plans, zero waste to landfill. Waste is always one of those areas. And that's just because that connects to operations very directly. That also is usually not measured the first time around. The companies have not measured. And you start measuring, and people can relate to the measures because they work with those materials every single day. And you can put targets that are very aggressive. And you can also put a vision that everyone understands, that is zero waste. So if you see of any company that is doing tangentially trying to get this started, you see some sort of waste initiative. Again, why? Because any plant manager, any distribution center manager, anyone that manages anything that is physical, waste you can also relate it to. That's always a good way where companies start. And the problem is it's not connected to the whole strategy, but that's always an area you find that I think is very easy to measure. Which gives me to the other one that is next to it on outbound, packaging. Packaging is another way of waste. It's waste that happens once you ship your products. It's visible to your customers. That's an easy way to start. Transportation impacts, also on the bottom line, I'm looking at those. Those are where people see less miles traveled, that's less cost. Less fuel consumption, that's less fuel, that's also less cost. Better redesign your networks, that's less distance, which is less cost, and also emissions. So you see that those ones over there are the ones that connect easily with your business, but not necessarily connect easily with your strategy. That's what companies have that always, because people grasp them. But that doesn't mean, according to the whole framework, those are the areas you should put emphasis on. The fact that you can do them doesn't mean you can do it. Go ahead.
Yep. Here. I have a question.
Yes.
How to determine the boundaries of your responsibility as a company? Because especially when you manage a supply chain, there are a lot of levels of vendors. There are a lot of suppliers that at the end you don't know who is supplying you, and you don't know if they are complying with those what is expecting from the company. So how to determine those boundaries of the responsibility of the company?
So let's talk about that. Someone has a thought? How do you determine your boundaries?
Well, we're doing auto companies, and Ford is taking care of this. So they draw the boundary at their tier 1 suppliers, and they say we want all of our tier 1 suppliers to comply with the ISO 14001 standards for shipping cost or shipping emissions, and then they've sort of not really thrown out the level 2 and level 3, but they're doing studies with the level 3 and saying we're seeing if we can figure out what our level 3 like suppliers are doing, but it's not really the focus. The focus is the tier 1. They provide training to the tier 1 on their environmental management system, so they're actively involved in the tier 1 and sort of peripherally involved in anyone beyond that.
So let's speak a little bit on Ford and the auto companies. So based on what you have read on Ford, what do you think is their strategic imperative on sustainability and environment?
Well, they hit it as far as marketing for their vehicles, and then besides that, so it seems like they're getting heavily driven by the Carbon Disclosure Project, because pretty much everything that is on their sustainability website is almost a copy and paste from what they put into the Carbon Disclosure Project. So I think they've been getting some external pressures recently, and as far as their corporate strategy goes, with stuff that's not being marketed to the customer, they're sort of convincing investors that they're starting to do the right thing and being a good corporate citizen, and starting to incorporate environmental stuff in their strategic CSR. But it's hard to determine. It's kind of hard to figure them out, because they really only give you the politician's line of we're doing this because it's good, and we're looking like all the way down to conflict minerals for our sources. And
so, but from your point of view, then should they spend more time? I'll get back to you to the question, but should they spend more time looking at their suppliers or not? I mean, I know I know you're not the first CEO, but
I mean, for a company that's as large as them, I think it would be extremely difficult and very cost intensive for them because they have tens of thousands of suppliers, and trying to track down every single one, I think would be insane. But they have a few level ones, and they are directly involved with those. And then the amount of suppliers exponentially grows when you leave tier 1. Like as soon as you get to tier 2, it goes up by an order of magnitude, and then another order of magnitude after that. And they think they have 10 tiers of suppliers. So to track down everyone down to level 10, I think is impossible.
So I'm going to ask Alexis a question, see if she remembers. I don't remember the exact number. What was the life cycle impact of a car in use versus, do you remember? It was like 60% or 70%. 70% of the emissions of the life cycle of a car happens during use, which means the number one issue if you're a car company should be fuel use. Design better vehicles. That should be all your energy. The rest is important, right? Those 30% is important, but it's not critical to achieving, let's say, significant impact over time. So this is one way to answer your question, and there's two ways. One is where these companies are trying to put most of their effort is on designing products that are more efficient. That's where they should be. I'm not saying they're doing it. That's where they should be. Because you can achieve both things. You could achieve better sales, better markets, but also that's where your impacts are. I mean, if you really care about the environment as Ford, you should pretty much say, you know what, my number one priority in the world is to make the most efficient cars, which they sometimes do, and I think they have this, you showed it last time, they have all this zero efficiency car, energy, zero emissions car, and that's where they are aiming for. And this immediately answers how deep you should work in your supply chain. Because if that's not your number one place, you should definitely do the right thing. What is the minimum thing you should do? You should mitigate risk in your supply chain, kind of comply on the things that people are asking, and that's why you probably will see that they will go straight to the minimum number of questions that the CDP report asks them to do. Because you want to do the right thing. I mean, sure, you're going to save money. It's good for you as a company. It resonates with your brand. You cannot sell a brand that is zero emissions if you're in your whole factory have a bunch of waste. And also all this translates into cost reductions, maybe. Yeah? So all these things kind of immediately tells you if my focus is the product, that's where the impacts are. Maybe what I should focus in my supply chain, the things that have direct impact. Put my resources there, some resources, but not try to cover all the network of OEMs that supply my car. So this is kind of I'm kind of backtracking on the question, but is the answer is not tied to how deep you should go, is where your impacts are on whatever is your main purpose you do. If your impacts are in the use phase, then maybe you should not spend that much time. I mean, do not ignore your suppliers, make them better, but it's not where you should try to go all the way down.
Like in the case of the car, they might have design principles that they can help make the car use less gas or, less, be lighter and drive farther. But in the case of like the Boots shampoo, Boots is a pharmacy chain in Europe, and they found out when they looked at the life cycle assessment of their shampoo that the largest impact is in the use. And so they decided they want to do consumer campaigns about taking shorter showers, using less heat, and obviously changing consumer behavior around your shower is not a very easy thing to change. So I think they have thus since dropped that kind of campaign, realizing that they can only affect their own internal operations and some of their suppliers as opposed to the downstream impacts.
Yeah. So So there was a couple of comments, and then I'll keep talking.
I was just going to say, as a point of comparison, I'm researching BMW, and most of the marketing material on their own website and others reporting on BMW, it's all about the cars that the technology that they're developing to make their cars more efficient. A lot of that's driven by just German engineering, but also a lot of the legislation that is taking effect in Europe. But another thing that's interesting is that they have an electric car sharing program that they've started up in Europe and now in the U.S. And so they're really kind of like drilling in on the use phase, which is where they have the most impact. So they're doing a pretty good job.
And also, I think I do not want to underestimate your insight. That is, these supply chains are massive. The car supply chain is just incredibly complex. They have no idea really where these things are, and they have really very little resources to try to spend time on going after that information. So they are hoping that by putting some pressure on tier one, this will propagate down somehow. And I think I think the list of priorities they're doing, I think what is the right thing. Tier one is probably how far they should go. Now let's look at another company. Who else is?
There was a quick question related to what you said. So I know in many industries this is not even close, but what if the place where there's more of an impact, you're already very close to being as efficient as possible. So, I'm assuming that motors are super efficient. This is not the case, but super efficient. Putting more resources into that type of research would yield much less results than, for example, trying to work with your supply chain. So how do you even determine when you're reaching a limit of what your levels are?
Well, my take on it would be most companies have an area that they can address, and so they might say their most controlled, it might be their logistics system or their transportation network, and they can say they've already optimized that. There's nothing else they can do, but there's usually, there's no company that can't go to their next level hotspot that they can start addressing. Some companies we've talked to have done what they call a materiality assessment, where they look at things that are material to their business, and then they assess the impacts on each of those, given their products or their operations or their employee engagement. And they pick all these spots, and then they can kind of rank how they address each of those. Trying to address the hotspots of their products or their own internal operations, and then they can code down that materiality assessment on how they address those impacts. I don't know if has anyone seen a materiality assessment as they've gone through? Nothing out there? Okay. Interesting.
So I want to hear from another of the case studies you're working on in terms of how deep you go into your supply chain, or have you observed in the companies you're working with? Alberto?
I'm working because we're doing Chevron and ExxonMobil.
So your supply chain is kind of short?
Yeah, and it's pretty obscure. So one area we can look at is shipping, ocean shipping of crude oil from one location to another, which of course there's a lot of impact from that. But aside from that, everything else is just within the plant.
I'm doing Toyota alongside of the BMW side there, and they have the halo effect of their previous 5 million cars that they sold. Yet they get hammered with the CDP scores are pretty low, and I think that actually having a car that is so successful, an image, reputation that is good in that market actually keeps them from doing better, and as a result they fall behind companies that have cars that typically are a lot more gas guzzling. So I think you can have an issue where a reputation gain somewhere actually prevents you from going further in other areas.
Okay. I want to hear from somebody else. Yep.
We're Nestle and Hershey's. I presented this a little while ago, but Nestle has a couple of supplier tiers, similar I think to you're saying with the cars, and so they require their tier one, their direct suppliers, to comply with their suppliers code, which is in and of itself a little vague. But then the vast majority of their suppliers, for their commodities, they really have no control or traceability over where those products are coming from.
So let's talk about that. It's a great example, and I'm glad you brought up food. And let's talk about food in many ways. So I just full disclosure. So Starbucks is a partner of our center, which a partner means they give us money for research. But this is part of the work we've done before going into research with them. But I'll talk about Starbucks. The same with Unilever, same with Nestle. And they have actually the imperative of trying to go as deep as possible in their supply chain as they can. And let me explain a little bit why. So let's talk about Starbucks, right? So Starbucks coffee. This is a supply chain that is very much goes to fragmented on the sourcing side. Lots of small farmers, similar like palm oil. Similar, many of those are like this. Bananas are not like this. Bananas is a few big manufacturers, but this one is small parcel manufacturers, and the Starbucks a little bit on the way they see their business, and is that we are providing our customers with like a third home and third place. They have some sort of wording along those lines, and coffee for us is an experience that we want to transmit to our customers, and that experience cannot be complete unless we can tell our customers that our product is the best product ever, right? And the best product ever, from their point of view, has multiple dimensions. It's, of course, quality, right, of the product. Number one, safety. You don't want to get ill. You have a place that is nice where you can enjoy your coffee and have friends and so forth. But the other dimension they are completely conscious about is we need to make sure that you are paying premium for this experience, and we want to make sure that we make our suppliers as prosperous as possible. For two reasons. One, because it's the image we sell. But the other one is that if we do not make them prosperous, we're not going to have the best quality coffee ever. Because if you take corners and you don't wash your beans well, and if you do not plant the best coffee in the world, and you move to another plantation, and then you lose the best coffee of the world. I mean, it's somehow embedded to you. Unilever has a similar view of the world. We sell fish sticks. It's no fish sticks, right? So I sell fish sticks for you to eat, but if there's no fish sticks. So I have to care about how people catch the fish, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term. So this immediately makes you be much more aware on not only the wholesaler that you buy your products from, but rather try to go as deep as possible. So in their cases, both Starbucks, Unilever, Nestle are trying to do the best they can on some of their key commodities to try to go as deep as possible. Now, Starbucks, because their ethos was a little bit more on the sustainability aspect, on the share value aspect of their supply chain from the very beginning, they actually have much better progress on that area. So they instituted the CAFE practices.
Where they have actually a supply chain certification group that goes to the farmers and actually certifies that the farmers are, trying to use less pesticides if they're not organic, and using less water, making sure they're paid above minimum wage. And then Starbucks also has a lot of different training programs, because one of their greatest problems is farming is becoming less of a desirable occupation around the world. That's not just a coffee problem, but a chocolate problem and a tea problem. And so kind of ensuring that the farmers have good quality of life, that they continue to grow coffee and they have a sustainable source of the coffee that they're sourcing. So they have auditors that go around the world, and they work with the farmers when they have a gap, that they're able to improve their practices in that area. So they started off the program, I forget, 2008, and they said they're going to get to 95% by 2015, and so they're about 93% of the way that all these farmers are certified around the world. They're third-party auditors, so it's not Starbucks going out to these farms and in Costa Rica and certifying them. So they do have third-party auditors, but then they report to Starbucks, who kind of does the overall view of it.
So they have a database with all their suppliers that are CAFE audited, right? This database is public. Actually, in theory, you can go into the CAFE practices website. You can request it. It's not public published, but it's public. If you request it, they may say no, but you can ask again, and maybe eventually they give you some information. But so they have gone deep in their supply chain, as deep as they can, with the resources they have. And the resources, as Alexis was outlining, is we set up the practices. We ask our buyers of coffee that unless you were willing to pay a little bit more for coffee that is CAFE certified, so you have the incentive and you're going to eventually make this happen. We do not force our suppliers to sell to us. They can sell to other people. So the CAFE practices are not only for Starbucks suppliers. Same with Unilever and the palm oil. I guess you went through all the palm oil discussions, so I will not repeat it. But Unilever is now trying to go directly to palm oil. Straight, no commodity pricing. So let's avoid that, let's say that lack of transparency, because it's so important to us that we rather pay a little bit more because this is what we need to care about. So it's a little bit of how deep. In this case, they went really deep because this is food supply chains, especially agricultural ones, are very critical for them as a business. So this gives you a sense of how deep you go is a function of where your impacts are and where your interests are and your risks are as well as a company. Anything else on that question? That's a very important one. Any other of your companies that is either different? Nope. All right, good. So let me then get you back to a couple of slides that we set up at the beginning, and I will try to give you. This was the first slide that we, when we started the course, we kind of went through it. So, go through each of the pieces real quick. All right, so these were the way we structured the course. And let me kind of try to explain why we did it that way, now that you have a better sense of what the strategy is. The strategy is actually to say no to many of these things that we have here. That's what a company should do. One is to understand that, and just because of the nature of how businesses have been developed, you have to somehow take this life cycle view of your product, which means you have to not only think about the things you control and buy from, but you have to somehow make sure you're keeping your radar how you use and recover your products. Let me give you an interesting example today, which goes back to how companies do their businesses. Do you know what Nespresso, the company that does these automated things? So we have a friend of mine from the Netherlands that also, I have an espresso machine, he has an espresso machine as well. Pure coincidence, we're talking about this, great, so you're part of their recycling program. Nespresso has a recycling program? Yeah, they have one. It's very important in Europe. When you get all your packages, you get like a bag, and you put your used bags, and they recycle it for you, because these the packages of coffee that you process in your machine are designed to be high quality, but they cannot be processed in the US for recycling. So there are waste, and there are lots of waste. And in Europe either. So basically they have the whole program for Nespresso customers is highly advertised in Europe on the closed loop. And here in the US, it's there somewhere in the website, but it's not the core thing. And now they have just to tell you that even this view, you have to have a market that cares, right? So even if you think of the best process in the US, people maybe don't care about recycling, so it's too expensive. We know how hard it is to set up those systems. So in Europe, that's much more developed. Anyway, so the first piece is to understand that you have to, designing this system is not easy, and we know that's not easy, and you require to either partner with a third party, and if you have the scale, like we took in Whirlpool, and the connection with the customer, you may be able to do this by yourself, but most of the time you probably have to do leverage a separate supply chain. May be expensive at the beginning, but over time it will get better. But if you need to own this is going to be a little bit hard. So that's understanding a little bit of the challenges of this, because this is very less studied in general in most companies, was one of our goals. Started to using the life cycle view of the world. Then we really went into understanding how to make the measurements of, at least in some degree, how a measurement is done on the use of resources, via life cycle assessment. Why? Because measurement is the only way you can eventually make decisions at some point. Doesn't matter how committed you are, at some point you have to make a trade-off. Should I do this or do that? I love the talk from 7th Generation. I thought it was great. Should you use these bags that are worse off for the environment, or should we use our laundry detergent containers? That's a really concrete decision. You do every single day. If you have no measurement, you cannot make the decision well. They know that what they're doing is worth for the environment on an individual unit basis. But they also know that if they don't offer that, they will not be in the shelf. So as a whole, it's better to be bad on one product, but better as a business. And that decision can only be made if you have the information. Otherwise, you will never be able to make those decisions, bad or good, or conscious or not. That's why life cycle assessment, understanding life cycle analysis, and try to bring it as close as possible to product design is very important. That's what we included in this class. Even though it's a supply chain class and there's a whole course on life cycle assessment, you need to understand that to be able to make real product decisions and real supply decisions, you have to somehow get into grabbing this information. This is what Nike did very well. After the whole process and labor and they embraced sustainability, they created a Nike Considered Index for their products, and they did life cycle analysis of materials, and they tried to inform their decisions as best as possible. Measurement, so people can make the decisions at the moment of making that trade-off. That was the idea of getting a carbon and life cycle thinking into the course. And the rest of the course was a little bit more focused on the other stakeholders that push you one way or the other to make the moral case, make the reputational case through attacks or partnerships, right? These are the stakeholders that actually push you a lot towards this thinking. These stakeholders, you need to understand them. You need to somehow understand them and engage them. But engage them not to agree with them on those cases, but to try to use them to inform eventually how to make those products. This is why you need to really understand where policy is going. We saw the policy talk. Policy, unfortunately, is going nowhere. So this is not going to be a policy discussion. We know that policy is very convoluted. It's going to be lagging always. So as a company, if you really want to be strategic, you need to be more about either understanding where the interests are of your customers, where you can find competitive advantage, where you can tie that to cost savings, something like that. But if your policy is going to move very, very slowly, you can drive policy a little bit farther ahead. But you saw the process of Mercury, and that's the easy one. The CO2 greenhouse gas policy discussion is stalled forever, and it will take many, many years. That's not a reason not to do anything about it, but you have to be very much aware that really effective policy making is not in the foreseeable future unless there's some big disaster. If something terrible happens and lots of people die for something that can be connected with climate change, trust me, next day you have regulation. But right now, the way things are moving, you saw the Mercury process. How many years was in total? 12, 14? Yeah, from the science consensus to getting all the things, and you saw that all this is just really compromises. It's never going to give you to taking specific action. So you have to be very aware of that. And you saw the views of the NGOs, which of course they are really committed usually to the moral argument. That's their main driving force. They believe this is the right thing to do. They are the conscience of humanity, and they want to move companies to do the moral thing. And companies need to push all the time. I want to do the moral thing, but that's not the way. That's not where my strengths are. The best way is to try to do something in between. Okay, good. So we give us to how to make this happen in a company. So this is the talk I give to executives when they ask me, well, so give me a process. People like 5-step process or 3 checklists or something. But ultimately, it's something like this, right? It's what we were talking earlier, is that you have to understand the pressures of your business, which we have talked to ad nauseum, and you have to make this decision that is say no to some things and don't do them, right? Somehow do not do them. And not do them means do the minimum, do the right thing, or do the things where they mitigate your risk, and pick a few that you really want to do well. And that's it kind of, and to do that properly, you have to measure somehow. And once you do that measurement, then you really set goals and targets, which these set goals and targets is the one thing, unfortunately, I cannot teach you, because I don't know how to do it. I wish I could tell you what's the best goal to do. 10% reduction of waste per year, 0 waste by 2020. What is the best goal? So Alexis, you have a better advice to our esteemed students?
Talking it through companies, they assess where they're at currently, what, quantities. If you're going to look at waste management, they look at how they've maybe, a lot of companies will do a pilot and see how they can do it within the first year, and then they'll look at what the competitors are proposing and, other people in the industry, and if they're the first of the type, the one thing that I've read in a lot of reports is, we're putting high goals out here, we may not hit them, so better go high. Then it's almost worse if you put low goals, because then you'll get critiqued for not shooting high enough. So you're never really going to win, but that's, they go through a large assessment of what they think they can do internally, and then looking at competitors and kind of gauging it that way.
What are your thoughts about levels of today or levels of
exactly? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I have some thoughts, but you have some thoughts as well?
I'm just wondering if that's a good way to start.
Yeah, so that's a good way to start. So let me just position this. If you look at any company, they have these vision goals, right? Which just put clear to the company where are your priorities, right? We want to have a zero emissions car by 2050, right? Maybe 2049, maybe 2030, whatever the number is. So you definitely need to have this idea of that vision target that tends to be super aggressive. Why? Because that just tells you where your priority is. That's a way to say, this matters to me, this is why I want to do it. And that's the one you see in all the CSR reports. That's the number one. The next one they do is what, like Alexis said. And this goes back to the process of setting goals and targets in any organization. Who here has experience in a company doing financial targets for sales? Who has done it? Who has been part of a process of a sales? How is that done? How does it happen when you, like a company, like I'm the CEO of a company, and I need to go next quarter or next year for my guidance for Wall Street, and I need to set up goals and targets. How do I do that?
We would just have like an annual operating plan process where basically they would bring in all the representatives from all the sales divisions, and they would come in and say, here's our major, they would come in one by one, like all the heads, and say, here are the customers that fall under us. Here's what we think, here's what we forecast the business that we're going to do based on XYZ reasons, so therefore here's our number, and then they roll that all up into one, and operations pulls up theirs, and there's kind of your number.
So they get a meeting, and everyone comes with a number. And that guy went back to his team beforehand and said, I have a meeting tomorrow with the CEO, how much are we going to sell? And the guy asked the other guy, how much I'm going to sell? Eventually, someone that really knows what happens says, oh yeah, I have 20 customers, I project by 20% growth, I see these opportunities, and they roll it up, and then they make some guesses, right? And they just rounded up the number that they good. The CEO said that's not good enough. You have to do better than this, right? And the CEO says 10% more. I said, I don't know, yes, you do it, and then you do it, and next year they do it, right? And that's the way it happens. I'm kind of a little bit exaggerating, but this is roughly what happens. You can make all the nice frameworks you want. You have to set targets, but this is what explains what happens. Yeah, someone cares about this number. They force you to think about what's the best way to do it, and you go back to your team and try to find some sort of middle ground between what you think is doable, what you really think you can do, and your manager and the CEO tries to stretch you beyond that limit, so you do not just send a number that makes no sense, because everyone is going to put a number that I know I'm going to meet. And the CEO knows this, and because of that, he says, I want double of that. And you play the game of tension, and you miss 1 year, you don't get your bonus, and next year you do a better job. That process is exactly the same process you should go for environmental targets, right? It's exactly the same process. I mentioned at the end of this long rant one important thing. Your bonus is set to this, right? So that doesn't mean money, but some sort of incentive is set to this process. If there's no incentive or penalty, nothing gets done. So you can get, in the short term, some things. But in other things, you need to provide specific targets. So this is where, again, we go back to, if you want to do carbon footprint emissions, you have to tie it to something that the person can do. For example, if you want to reduce 20% of your emissions or go to the same level of emissions as 2020 based on the 2001 baseline, then you have to connect those emissions to something you can take action on, energy use. Go ahead.
Don't you run the risk, though, then, of kind of, I don't know, questioning or calling into question the integrity of the process? Because then you could have engineering in the way you're reporting or measuring. And if you tie some sort of financial incentive to the goals, then there's the potential to have a lot of effort to have good results on paper, but maybe not necessarily to be driving towards real results.
So let's talk about that's a really good point. So the companies that are successful at this, the measurement systems need to be as reliable as possible to avoid that problem, because if you don't have a good way to measure the progress, then you can fudge the numbers. So you have to connect it back to whatever metric of your business you can get actually reliable information on. And I think that's why the leading companies, I think that's what they do more, the better. Is that, sure, we want to do carbon footprint, and we do with this big GG protocol CDP report, but somehow as they go down, they tie this to number of miles driven on my car, number of kilowatt hours of my. So that process of kind of somehow connecting these goals and measurement systems, that I think is the hard part that companies take a long time to develop, because the information you need to measure, you may not be capturing. So you have to build, let's say, that knowledge internally and then eventually try it. But I agree, if you don't have some sort of connection to the real business operations, you cannot really set credible targets and tie it to money. And I'll give you another example. I know you have a question before I move to.
On the note of measurement, like in the palm oil case, and also like with Chevron, to do third-party verifications of things just to verify before they award incentives in form of bonuses or whatever.
So not all the performance gives bonuses, but they do have an impact on your evaluation. So let's suppose you don't have to tie as a bonus something, but you have to meet certain criteria. And if you don't meet them, you know there's a risk that your job is not going to be there for you in 2, 3, 4 years. No one expects so. I mean, that was your question. Was that your question?
No, I'm just saying that
as a comment. Okay.
Yeah, one way to ensure that the system isn't being exploited is that companies
third party. Yeah. Absolutely. So third-party verification is one way to try to achieve that balance and make sure you have a third, especially as you go deeper in your supply chain. But I do want to emphasize that to be serious, let's say, I'm saying that these companies are not serious, but to be able to fully embed it to your business capabilities as a company, somehow you need to set goals and targets that are tied to ways that are credible measures. You cannot just be, everyone does their own estimation of CO2, right? It needs to be, I have a CO2 calculator that is somewhere in my system that I can click a button and know how things are going. If I cannot do that, then this is just a CSR report that happens at the end of the year. Let me just differentiate what I just said. So everyone can come after the fact, and I can do an estimation of CO2, hire MIT, hire Stanford, and I can go in and spend 6 months, right? And this is how much CO2 you save. Great, but that doesn't mean that the company is doing anything, right? If you're a manager, you have to get a report every semester, every quarter, and this is how we're doing, so you can take action. And the only way you can do that is to connect that measurement of environmental performance to something that you are collecting in your day-to-day operation. Whatever that is. Energy use, again, number of tons of miles you sold to waste disposal, something, right? And someone has to figure out how that number connects to the environmental goal you're trying to achieve and set that target to that metric. This process is what is difficult. And that's why the measurement is the kind of the tricky part, because companies are not used to measure. And if you do not do that, the only thing you have is a great CSR reporting machine. You are not really changing your business or your suppliers' businesses. You have a great CSR reporting, which is needed. It's a precondition. Unless you know how to do it yourself, you cannot put it in your metric. You have to trust it. You have to develop the expertise. You have to have the right people. You have the SAP systems to be rolled out, whatever you use. Yeah? Someone needs to do it. If you don't have it, you cannot do it. And those goes back to suppliers. And we'll talk about suppliers in a second. But is there any questions or comments about what I said? I want to make sure this is clear.
A lot of the incentive is based on stock price. Companies don't really give out, big checks. They give out 200 shares or whatever. And there's a conflict between getting that share price to increase and doing the right thing.
Yeah.
For companies that have target incentives that are stock bet driven, do you have any suggestions for setting goals and targets?
That's where the only thing I like there is the Dow Jones Sustainable Index, even though I hate that index. It's a great index because at least people connect it to stock prices in a more direct way. Even though the connection is because of sales, the majority is revenue, like 30% of it is revenue. But they have at least some metrics that are environmental transparency that people try to connect with stock prices. I have to say that public companies have a really hard time to make these aspirational goals because they're not connected to value directly. This long-term, short-term trade-off that prevents them of embedding a good sustainability practice is very hard. Let me give you the other answer. Who was talking here? Seventh Generation said that, although they're not publicly traded. They said our shareholders know they're getting lower return over investment than other, and they buy our stock with that understanding, right? Unilever shareholders know that Unilever is making some trade-offs for the long term, and they're buying their stock. Now, the promise and the belief is that they're going to recover that value over the long run, but ultimately speaking, I do not think there's a good connection you can make. I'm being totally honest. I have not seen it that you can make a real concrete connection between a stock price and sustainability, in the short term. What I've heard the argument, which I think is a real argument, is a company that can develop this kind of system is a company that must have a really sophisticated management, which means this company must be run by smart people, which means this company must be making some good money. But this is a very indirect argument. It's not a direct argument of, oh, you did this, you can get money back. It's more, if you're willing to pull this off and not crash your business, that means that you are a really well-run management company, and we believe that you are going to be able to achieve other things because besides all your complexity, you have been able to embed sustainability in your day-to-day operations. It's kind of a poor answer.
Wall Street is going to let you get away with it for so long, right?
Yeah, for so long, yes. At some point, yes. So that's kind of an argument of capabilities more than an argument of delivering results. It's just, you should be able to do this well.
Just to quickly build on this, today we actually had the CEO of, I'll remember the name of the company in a little while. They were investing not in sustainability in the green part, but mostly in investing in their employees and paying them higher higher wages, while still offering low prices to customers. And he was mentioning, he was talking about his experience of having a really hard time at the beginning when they initially went public because people in Wall Street didn't understand. But they kept true to their strategy, and that now their stock price has gone up significantly, and people do buy their stock and trade it, and it's actually a very valuable stock. But then it does take time. If your entire strategy is long term, you kind of wait for Wall Street to understand it too. And not everyone can do it, but if you have a strategy, it does work. It worked for them.
I think that's the. I agree. I think that's possible. Yes, it's always possible. Let me actually say two more things on setting goals and targets. I think that I'm trying to emphasize this point, supplier selection. Let's talk about when you want to go to your tier 1 suppliers and make them greener, right? And you want to really make them part of your strategy. If there's no measure in your scorecard to your supplier selection, this means nothing. So when the buyer is sitting in the table and he has to make a decision on which supplier to select, and there's no metric there that says sustainability, trust me, that person is not going to do the best effort. Now, the problem is if you have never done it, how do you start, right? How do you start putting a metric there? You have to give people, educate them first. You have to first, I recommend you to measure this, right? It's not part of our evaluation process. And you do that for 2-3 years. You first understand your capabilities of your suppliers. You have to get to know them. You get their information. That's why the CDP report actually is quite good. You have a structured process. They start knowing, you should measure your energy use. Oh, really? Okay, let me start measuring it, right? And the next year they come back. I still do not know how to do it. The next year they come back, and eventually they get good at measuring. You do the same for waste. You do the same for the things you care about. You have to somehow teach them what it takes to measure what you care about. Once they have done a few iterations, then you can really start putting in a contract. And I think if you see what companies have done, who I was talking recently, yes. This may not be public yet. So they have been asking for their sustainability metric to their suppliers for 5 years. And next year is going to be mandatory. It's going to be a requirement for buying products. It's a big CPG company, huge. And they have done all the traditional greenhouse gas metrics, waste metrics, traditional ones, and they have always sent information for you to look into that information. Starting next year, it's going to be mandatory, and if you don't have it, you're not our supplier. And in 5 years, they're going to reduce by 20%. So what I'm pointing out is that there's a first phase where you just ask for the information, so people build their own metric systems. You cannot expect them to be sustainable if you have never measured. So by asking your suppliers for the information, even though it's not in the scorecard of selection, you start this cycle for them. This is what matters to me. When I'm buying from you, I want you to tell me how much energy you use, how much waste you generate. Oh, it matters to you, so I better start measuring it. And you somehow start creating this cycle with your suppliers. But only the moment where you change this cycle into I bring it into your procurement organization as a decision-making process like price, quality, safety, CO2 reduction. Only at that time, it really becomes part of your business. Otherwise, it's just good wishing. It's a long process. So what I just said is a 5-year cycle, especially when you talk about large companies with many, many suppliers. Great example of this, Natura in Brazil. They have specific targets for their suppliers of CO2 reduction. They have their templates. This is how you fill it out, how much energy you do. This is exactly what you expect from them, and this is exactly how much reduction I expect from you year to year. And if you don't get it, you're no longer my supplier. But this took some time, even though they're a very sustainable company as a whole. So, this is what you do internally, and of course, always you have to stay in tune with your moral compass, your partners that tell you which are the issues that you think, which areas of the world you have to be worried about that could have more regulation, right? How can you make sure your reputation, you have to defend all those dimensions. So this is, I think, how you can develop long-term strategy. So we have to wrap up now, but on Wednesday, we're going to hear someone from a company, hopefully tell them how they did it. So keep some of these things in mind to see if we can identify these patterns going or not. I think some of them are there, others are not. So we'll see how good they are on their strategy. Ask tough questions. And I wanted to do more guidance, but I talk a lot, for the team project. So what we want in your team project is to not only both of you dividing your companies, but actually comparing them, discussing what makes them better, and eventually trying to make an assessment is this company that has a higher ranking in CDP deserve it or not? And this is why they deserve it, based on some of the things we've talked so far. All right? Okay, thank you so much, and I'll see you on Wednesday.